The merchant stood at the city gates of Florence in August 1348 and smelled it before he saw anything. 5 miles outside the city walls. 5 miles of Tuscan countryside between him and Florence. And he could smell death. Not faint. Not subtle. Overwhelming. The stench of 2,000 corpses rotting simultaneously in summer heat, of buboes bursting and leaking pus into streets, of gangrene turning limbs black while people still breathed, of overflowing latrines mixed with decomposing bodies mixed with the acrid smell of quicklime dumped on mass graves. The merchant had traveled from Milan intending to trade. He turned around. Abandoned the journey. Fled back to Milan. Because the smell told him everything he needed to know. Florence was dying. And death smelled like this. Medieval people described plague smell in terms that remain horrifying 7 centuries later. The stench of corruption that rises from the city can be perceived 3 leagues distant. That's from a Florentine chronicle. 3 leagues. 9 miles. The smell of death hangs over London like a fog that will not lift. That's from an English chronicle. The city reeks of putrefaction such that birds flying overhead fall dead from the poisoned air. That's from a French chronicle, probably exaggeration but conveying the intensity of smell. The odor of decaying flesh is so strong it overwhelms incense burned in churches during Massachusetts. That's from an Italian priest's letter. These weren't metaphors. These were literal descriptions of what plague smelled like in cities experiencing epidemic mortality. Before we trace the stench city by city, describing exactly what each component of plague smell was and why medieval cities became olfactory nightmares, and trust me, we're going smell by smell, street by street, making this so visceral you'll want to stop reading. Comment where you're from. Because your city probably smelled like this during plague. Every major European city experienced plague. Every major city became an open-air morgue. The smell would have been identical whether you lived in London or Paris or Florence or Barcelona. Comment your location. Let's map where the stench of death once hung in the air so thick people claimed you could taste it. Let's start with the primary source of smell, decomposing human bodies. A single decomposing corpse produces an intense, immediately recognizable smell within 24 to 48 hours of death in warm conditions. The smell comes from bacterial breakdown of tissues producing volatile organic compounds, putrescine, cadaverine, scatol, indole, hydrogen sulfide, ammonia, methane. These compounds are intensely malodorous at concentrations measured in parts per billion. Your nose can detect cadaverine at 0.00002 milligrams per liter. That's incredibly sensitive. Evolution made humans extremely sensitive to decomposition smell because decomposing bodies attract disease vectors and indicate environmental hazards. We're programmed to find corpse smell repulsive and flee from it. Now imagine not one corpse. Imagine 2,000 corpses decomposing simultaneously in Florence during August 1348. Florence's pre-plague population was approximately 120,000. Plague killed 50,000 to 60,000 over 6 months. At peak mortality in July-August 1348, Florence was experiencing 300 to 400 deaths per day. The living couldn't bury the dead fast enough. Bodies accumulated in streets, in houses, in churches. Contemporary sources describe houses with entire families dead inside, bodies rotting for days or weeks before anyone dared enter to remove them. Churches filled with bodies awaiting burial, coffins stacked 4 or 5 deep because mass graves couldn't be dug fast enough. The Florentine chronicler Marchione di Capostefani wrote that the smell of death was so pervasive that people abandoned their homes and fled to the countryside seeking fresh air. The decomposition process produces different smells at different stages. Fresh death, 0 to 24 hours, produces relatively little smell as autolysis begins, but bacterial action is minimal. Early decomposition, 1 to 3 days, produces sweet sickly smell as bacteria proliferate and begin breaking down soft tissues. Active decay, 4 to 10 days, produces the worst smells as massive bacterial blooms liquefy tissues, rupturing cell walls and releasing contents. Advanced decay, 10+ days, produces ammonia and sulfur smells as remaining tissues dry and different bacterial communities take over. The Florence streets in August 1348 contained bodies at every stage of decomposition. Fresh corpses from that morning. Bodies dead 3 days bloating in the heat. Week-old corpses liquefying into streets. The olfactory assault was total and unrelenting. But bodies weren't the only source of smell. Living plague victims produced smells that witnesses described as distinctly horrifying. The buboes, swollen lymph nodes in groin, armpit, neck, grew to the size of eggs or apples and often burst, leaking pus and blood. The pus from ruptured buboes had a characteristic smell that plague survivors described as uniquely disgusting. One Italian physician wrote that the smell of burst buboes was worse than any battlefield wound, because it combined decomposition smell, the necrotic tissue in the bubo, with infection smell, bacterial populations in the pus, with the sweet smell of blood. Patients with burst buboes smelled of corruption while still alive. Pneumonic plague, plague infection in the lungs, produced another characteristic smell. Patients coughed up blood mixed with lung tissue and bacteria. The bloody sputum had a smell witnesses described as metallic and rotten simultaneously. Pneumonic plague patients' breath smelled of death because their lungs were literally rotting while they still breathed. Caregivers described being able to smell pneumonic plague on a patient's breath from across a room. The smell was so characteristic that physicians used it as a diagnostic sign. Septicemic plague, systemic blood infection, caused gangrene as blood vessels collapsed and tissues died from lack of oxygen. Fingers and toes turned black. Noses turned black. Ears turned black. The gangrenous tissues rotted while patients lived, producing decomposition smell from living bodies. Multiple chroniclers describe plague victims smelling of death days before they died because their extremities were already decomposing. One French physician wrote that he could diagnose plague by smell alone. If a patient smelled of gangrene, they had plague and would die within days. Now let's compound all these individual smells into the collective urban stench. Medieval cities lacked modern sanitation. Sewage flowed in open gutters. Garbage accumulated in streets. Animals lived within city walls. Cities normally smelled bad by modern standards, a permanent background odor of excrement, rotting food, animal waste, industrial processes like tanning and metalwork that produced noxious fumes. But normal medieval urban smell was manageable. Residents adapted. Visitors complained but adjusted within days. Plague transformed normal urban malodor into olfactory nightmare. The underlying background smell remained: sewage, garbage, animals. But on top of that base layer came the smell of mass death. Thousands of decomposing bodies. Thousands of living plague victims with burst buboes and gangrenous limbs and bloody breath. Overflowing mass graves where quicklime was dumped to accelerate decomposition, creating a chemical smell mixing with organic decomposition. Blood in the streets from bodies being dragged to graves, attracting flies and rats and creating its own decay smell. The smell layers compounded into something no city had experienced before because no city had experienced this mortality rate before. Here's the first question I want in comments. If you could smell plague approaching your city from 5 miles away, would you flee immediately or stay to help? Flee or stay and help? Your answer reveals your values. Medieval people faced this choice. Many fled. Many stayed. The smell told them what was coming. Comment your answer. London in 1348 to 1349 experienced this same olfactory apocalypse. London's pre-plague population was approximately 80,000. Plague killed perhaps 30,000 to 40,000. Peak mortality occurred in autumn 1348 through winter into spring 1349. London had one advantage over Florence: cooler climate. Decomposition proceeds slower in cool weather. But London had disadvantages too. Higher population density in some quarters, worse sanitation infrastructure, the Thames River becoming contaminated with bodies and refuse. English chronicles describe London's smell as penetrating clothing, as clinging to hair and skin, as being impossible to escape even by closing windows and burning incense. One chronicle states that birds avoided flying over London because the corrupted air was toxic. Almost certainly exaggeration, but conveying that the smell was perceived as physically harmful. The miasma theory, the medieval belief that disease spread through bad air, seemed confirmed by plague smell. If cities smell like death and people are dying, the logical medieval conclusion is that the smell causes death. Miasma theory was wrong. Plague spread through fleas, not air, but was reasonable given available evidence. Medieval people responded to the smell by trying to purify air. Burning aromatic woods, spreading sweet-smelling herbs in streets, carrying nosegays of flowers, wearing pomanders filled with spices. Plague doctors' famous beaked masks contained aromatic herbs in the beak, intended to filter corrupted air before breathing it. None of this worked against plague because the smell wasn't the vector. But medieval people didn't know that. They were fighting smell with smell, trying to overwhelm death's stench with perfume. Paris in 1348 experienced catastrophic plague and corresponding smell. Paris was Europe's largest city with population perhaps 200,000. Plague killed approximately 50,000. The city's density made smell even worse. Narrow medieval streets with buildings overhanging created urban canyons where smells concentrated and air didn't circulate well. French chronicles describe certain Paris streets becoming impassable not from barricades but from smell so intense people couldn't breathe while walking through. The smell caused vomiting, caused fainting, caused people to wrap cloth around faces just to move through certain neighborhoods. The Hôtel Dieu Hospital, Paris's main hospital, became a notorious smell source. The hospital admitted hundreds of plague patients daily during peak epidemic. Most died within days. The bodies accumulated faster than staff could remove them. Chronicles describe the area around Hôtel Dieu as unwalkable due to smell. Cairo in 1348 to 1349 experienced unique olfactory horror due to climate. Cairo's heat accelerated decomposition. Bodies decomposed in hours in Cairo's summer heat that routinely exceeds 40 degrees Celsius 104 degrees Fahrenheit. The Egyptian chronicler Al-Makrizi wrote that Cairo's smell during plague was unbearable beyond description, and that residents fled to the desert seeking air that didn't smell of death. Cairo had another problem: limited burial space. The city's cemeteries filled rapidly. Mass graves were dug in the desert outside city walls, but transporting thousands of bodies from city to desert created logistics nightmare. Bodies waited days for transport, decomposing in staging areas. The smell around these staging areas was so intense that Al-Makrizi describes them as places where no living thing could survive. Venice in 1348 faced unique problems as a maritime city built on islands in a lagoon. Venice's normal smell included salt water, fish markets, sewage flowing into canals. Plague added decomposition smell mixing with lagoon water. The canals became contaminated with fluids leaking from bodies being transported to burial islands. The island of Poveglia was designated as plague burial site. Thousands of bodies were ferried to Poveglia and buried or burned. The smell from Poveglia drifted across Venice on prevailing winds. Venetian chronicles describe being able to smell Poveglia from Piazza San Marco on certain wind days. That's several kilometers distance. The smell of burning bodies mixed with decomposition created a unique stench that Venice residents claimed was distinctly worse than Florence or other cities. Now let's talk psychology of living with constant death smell. Modern humans in developed countries rarely smell decomposition. We encounter it perhaps at funerals with embalmed bodies in sealed coffins, minimal smell. Or occasionally from dead animals on roads, unpleasant but brief exposure. Medieval plague survivors lived with intense decomposition smell 24/7 for months. You couldn't escape it. It was in streets, in homes, in churches, in workplaces. It permeated clothing. It saturated walls and furniture. It was omnipresent. The psychological impact was devastating. Multiple survivors described the smell as driving them to despair more than the death itself. One Florentine survivor wrote that the smell was more unbearable than watching my children die, because the smell was constant, unrelenting, inescapable, a permanent reminder of death surrounding you. The smell prevented sleep. Many survivors described insomnia caused by smell-induced nausea. The smell prevented eating. Food tasted of death because the smell overwhelmed taste. The smell caused dissociation. Several survivors described feeling detached from reality because the smell was so far outside normal experience that it felt like nightmare or divine punishment rather than earthly reality. Some survivors described olfactory habituation, adapting to the smell over weeks until it became less noticeable. The human olfactory system does adapt to constant smells by down-regulating receptor sensitivity. But adaptation has limits. The smell of thousands of decomposing bodies exceeds adaptation capacity. Survivors who claimed they'd gotten used to it probably experienced partial adaptation but not complete habituation. The smell remained noticeable, just less immediately overwhelming. Other survivors described permanent olfactory damage. Some lost sense of smell entirely after months of exposure, possibly from olfactory nerve damage from constant exposure to high concentrations of irritant compounds like ammonia and hydrogen sulfide. Some developed smell aversion where any decomposition smell, even mild smells like spoiled food, triggered panic or nausea. Modern PTSD research recognizes smell as powerful trauma trigger. Plague survivors probably experienced smell-triggered trauma responses for years after plague ended. Here's the second question for comments. If you survived plague but permanently lost your sense of smell from exposure to death smell for months, would you consider that acceptable cost of survival? Acceptable or not acceptable? Comment your answer. Because this was real cost some survivors paid. They lived but lost one of their 5 senses. Your answer reveals how you value different aspects of sensory experience. Let's examine specific attempts to combat the smell. Wealthy families burned massive quantities of aromatic woods, cedar, sandalwood, rosewood, trying to overwhelm death smell with perfume smell. This created a new smell, decomposition mixed with wood smoke. Multiple chronicles describe the smell combination as worse than death alone, because the perfume didn't mask decomposition. It just created a sickly sweet and rotten combination that was uniquely nauseating. But wealthy families continued burning aromatics because doing something felt better than doing nothing even if the intervention made smell worse. Churches burned enormous amounts of frankincense and myrrh during services, trying to purify corrupted air through sacred smoke. Again, this didn't work. It just created decomposition plus incense smell that witnesses described as making mockery of holy materials by mixing them with corruption. But churches continued burning incense because liturgical tradition demanded it and because cessation would signal complete hopelessness. If even churches admitted their rituals were powerless against the smell, what hope remained? City governments tried chemical interventions. They ordered streets washed with vinegar, believing vinegar's acidity would neutralize corrupted air. They ordered lime dumped in streets, believing lime would absorb miasma. They ordered fires lit at intersections, believing smoke would drive away bad air. None of this affected plague transmission because plague spread through fleas, not air. But these interventions did affect smell marginally. Lime does absorb some odor compounds. Smoke does temporarily overwhelm other smells. The interventions provided psychological benefit even if epidemiological benefit was nil. Some cities tried removing the smell source by mandating rapid burial. Florence passed ordinances requiring bodies be buried within 24 hours of death. Paris required 12 hours. Venice required immediate removal of bodies from homes to burial islands. These ordinances were unenforceable during peak mortality. There weren't enough grave diggers. There weren't enough carts to transport bodies. There weren't enough grave sites. The ordinances existed on paper but couldn't be implemented in reality. The smell remained because the corpses remained. Now let's talk about specific smells in specific locations within cities. The smell wasn't uniform. Some areas smelled worse than others based on wind patterns, density, proximity to mass graves or hospitals. Let's map Florence's smell landscape in August 1348. The area around Santa Maria Nuova Hospital was described as utterly impassable due to smell. The hospital admitted hundreds of patients daily. Most died within 48 hours. The bodies accumulated in the hospital courtyard awaiting burial teams. Witnesses described the courtyard as filled with corpses stacked like firewood, and the smell as visible as fog. The latter is obviously metaphor but conveys intensity. The area around Santa Croce Church was another smell epicenter. Santa Croce had massive burial trenches dug in its courtyard for mass plague burial. The trenches were 20 feet deep and held hundreds of bodies each. Fresh bodies were added daily at the top while bodies at the bottom decomposed into liquid. The smell from these trenches was so intense that buildings within 200 meters were abandoned. Residents fled not from plague but from smell. The Arno riverbanks smelled catastrophically because bodies were sometimes thrown into the river rather than buried. This was illegal but happened anyway when burial capacity was exceeded. The bodies washed downstream, decomposing in the water, contaminating drinking water supplies, creating smell wherever they washed ashore. The Arno stench was described as distinct from normal decomposition. It had an aquatic rot smell mixing with normal putrefaction. The wealthy neighborhoods on hillsides north of Florence smelled less because prevailing winds carried smell away from hills and because wealthy families had resources to maintain sanitation better. But even wealthy neighborhoods weren't spared. One Florentine nobleman wrote that he could smell death from his hilltop villa, like smoke from a distant fire. The smell penetrated even areas that wealth normally protected. London's smell map would show similar patterns. The area around East Smithfield Cemetery, established specifically for plague burials, was described in chronicles as place of perpetual stench. The cemetery filled so rapidly that bodies were buried in trenches with minimal earth covering. The smell carried across East London on prevailing west winds. The Thames riverbanks smelled catastrophically for the same reason as the Arno, illegal body disposal into the river. The area around St. Bartholomew's Hospital smelled like all hospitals smelled, death and disease concentrated in one location. Wealthier neighborhoods in Westminster smelled less than poor neighborhoods in Southwark where density was higher and sanitation worse. Cairo's smell map would show the old Cairo district smelling worse due to density and proximity to the Nile where bodies were sometimes disposed of illegally. The area around Al-Nasir Hospital was another epicenter. The desert burial grounds west of the city created a zone of smell that drifted east on prevailing winds. The smell geography was predictable based on wind patterns and proximity to death concentrations. Now let's compare medieval plague smell to modern smell disasters to give you reference frame. The 1984 Bhopal disaster in India released methyl isocyanate gas that smelled intensely of burning chilies. People described the smell as overwhelming and causing immediate panic. That smell affected a city of 500,000 for days. Plague smell affected cities for months. The 2004 Indian Ocean tsunami created massive decomposition smell in coastal areas where thousands of bodies decomposed in tropical heat. Aid workers described the smell as the worst thing about tsunami response, and many required masks to work in affected areas. That smell lasted weeks in specific areas. Plague smell lasted months across entire cities. The closest modern equivalent would be mass casualty events without rapid body removal in hot climates. Hurricane Katrina created localized intense decomposition smell in New Orleans in areas where bodies weren't recovered quickly. The Haiti earthquake created similar smell problems. But these were localized and temporary. Plague was citywide and months-long. No modern developed world population has experienced anything comparable. We can't truly understand what medieval plague survivors endured because we have no experiential reference frame. Let me ask a third question for comments. Knowing plague spread through fleas not smell, and knowing medieval people were trying to combat smell uselessly, what would you do if you were there with modern knowledge? Tell them it's fleas, or let them focus on smell to feel like they're doing something. Comment your answer. It's a real moral dilemma. Correcting them might help, but they'd have no way to verify you're correct and might ignore you. Letting them focus on smell wastes resources but provides psychological benefit. What would you do? The aftermath of plague saw cities obsessed with smell prevention. Post-plague urban reforms focused heavily on sanitation, not because anyone understood germ theory but because everyone believed miasma theory. If bad smells cause plague, prevent bad smells to prevent future plague. Cities invested in sewage systems, garbage collection, street cleaning, all aimed at reducing urban smell. These interventions didn't prevent plague, which returned repeatedly for 400 years, but they did improve urban living conditions generally and probably reduced other diseases spread through fecal-oral transmission. The obsession with smell produced the plague doctor's iconic beaked mask. The mask was invented in 1619 by French physician Charles Delorme specifically to filter corrupted air through aromatic herbs packed in the beak. The mask didn't prevent plague, doctors wearing masks died at high rates, but it did reduce smell exposure. Plague doctors wearing masks could tolerate working in highly contaminated areas longer than doctors without masks because the herbs in the beak partially masked decomposition smell. The mask's effectiveness was psychological and olfactory, not epidemiological. Perfume industry expanded post-plague partly driven by demand for smell masking. Wealthy Europeans became obsessed with personal fragrance as protection against corrupted air. Perfumes that had been luxuries became perceived necessities. The perfume industry in Grasse, France became economically significant post-plague partly due to this demand. The smell legacy of plague persisted for centuries in European perfume culture. The literary and artistic legacy of plague smell appears in countless works. Boccaccio's Decameron describes plague smell repeatedly, using it as shorthand for horror. Petrarch's letters mention the smell. Chaucer references it. Dante's depiction of Hell and Inferno includes smell descriptions that scholars believe were influenced by plague smells Dante may have witnessed or heard described. The smell became embedded in European cultural memory as signifier of apocalypse. One final call to action. Comment 5 miles if you're still reading. Tell me which sense-based historical topic I should cover next. The sound of medieval battlefields? What medieval food actually tasted like? The touch of disease? Comment your preference plus 5 miles for counting. The stench of death killed nobody. The smell didn't spread plague. But the smell broke spirits. The smell drove people to despair. The smell made survival feel worse than death would have been. The smell traumatized survivors for lifetimes. The smell persisted in cultural memory for centuries. The smell became the signature sensory experience of the worst catastrophe in European history. And the smell could return. If pandemic strikes with medieval mortality rates, if bodies pile up faster than we can dispose of them, if urban infrastructure collapses and sanitation fails, the smell will return. The decomposition smell that medieval people described as perceivable 5 miles distant will fill our cities just as it filled theirs. Because decomposition chemistry hasn't changed. Human bodies decompose today exactly as they decomposed in 1348. The volatile organic compounds are identical. The smell is identical. We're protected from experiencing that smell only by technology and infrastructure that could fail. The smell waits. Always waits. Like plague waits. Like death waits. Like catastrophe waits. Ready to fill cities again when systems fail. When bodies outnumber gravediggers. When death comes faster than we can dispose of it. The merchant stood at Florence's gates and smelled death 5 miles away. We stand at the gates of the future and can't smell what's coming. But it's coming. It always comes. The stench returns. Eventually. Inevitably. Forever waiting to overwhelm us again. The smell of death. The smell of plague. The smell of civilizational collapse. 5 miles away. Getting closer. Always closer. Until the smell surrounds us and we understand what medieval people understood. That hell isn't fire. Hell is smell. The smell of death everywhere. Forever. Inescapable.